Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
There's never been a faster or easier way to start your weight loss journey than with PlushCare. PlushCare accepts most insurance plans and gives you online access to board-certified physicians who can prescribe FDA-approved weight loss medications like Wegovy and Zepbound for those who qualify. Take charge of your health and speak with a board-certified physician about a weight loss plan that's right for you. Get started today at plushcare.com/weight loss. That's plushcare.com/weight loss. plushcare.com/weight loss.
Since 2013, Bombas has donated over 100 million socks, underwear, and T-shirts to those facing homelessness. If we counted those on air, this ad would last over 1,157 days. But if we counted the time it takes to make a donation possible, it would take just a few clicks. Because every time you make a purchase, Bombas donates an item to someone who needs it.
Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
Hello and welcome to the Napoleon Assist. Happy December, folks. I know we are well into the run-up towards that dreaded C word, Christmas. I hope you're kind of enjoying the opportunity to stay out of the kind of cold and miserable and dark weather outside. I'm hoping that you've got the Christmas shopping out the way and you can sit back with a glass of something and enjoy what promises to be a brilliant episode, because I am joined by Andrew Field to talk about the Battle of Quatre Bras. You might be a little bit surprised by this because, yes, the anniversary is obviously in June, but I particularly like Andrew's work, which for me means that I'm quite happy to come back to Waterloo, even though we have sort of done it to death in the past. Andrew is a retired army colonel who's an author of a host of books on the Waterloo campaign, crucially from the French perspective, that perspective that ironically quite often gets pushed to the side. They include Grouchy's Waterloo, there's a whole podcast to be had on that, Waterloo, Rout and Retreat, The French at Waterloo, Eyewitness Accounts, that's in 2 volumes, and that's besides Talavera, Wellington's first victory in Spain. Today, though, we are discussing his book on Quatre Bras, The Prelude to Waterloo. Andrew, welcome back. It's been a heck of a long time since you were on here, myth-busting Waterloo for us. How are you doing?
Yeah, very well indeed. Thank you. I've been very busy since then and working on some more presentations and another book. So I've been keeping myself really busy.
Absolutely. We just had a good kind of half an hour's chat before we started recording about all kinds of interesting things and plans to have you back again in the future. But let's dive in, shall we? Because I've kind of touched on this already in that little preamble. If there's one campaign in the Napoleonic era that could be said to have been done to death, it is probably the Waterloo campaign. But that's not quite right, is it? Because the Battle of Waterloo itself perhaps has been wildly overdone, particularly from that regurgitation of the Anglo-centric perspective, which is why I particularly like your work. It offers a very, kind of fresh and important perspective that gets pushed to the side. So in the process of all of this, Quatre Bras does sort of tend to be glossed over in those stereotypical works. It's sort of this prelude to the big one, inverted commas. Why do you think that's traditionally been the case?
Okay, well, I think there are probably 4 reasons why this is so. First of all, I think having studied all the sort of first-hand accounts, or as many as I can, people that wrote about or soldiers that wrote about the campaign, officers that wrote the campaign, inevitably concentrated on what they saw as the big, major, cataclysmic battle. And certainly from a French perspective, that was true, because of course that was such a huge defeat. It was people trying to come to terms with that, and Quatre Bras from the French perspective therefore was very much pushed into the sort of shadows. Secondly, of course, is a matter of scale. If you look at the numbers engaged from sort of Wellington's army in the French perspective and the French perspective, they're probably half the numbers, and that's not even talking about the Prussians. So it was a much smaller scale battle. Just of course, Waterloo itself was that final decisive defeat of Napoleon, and therefore, you know, that in itself sort of makes sure it hits the headlines. And also, I think that Quatre Bras was, and I think we'll probably talk about this later, it was no great victory for either side, and so neither side had much to gloat about or to proclaim, and therefore it tends to get glossed over. But I think I know from chatting to you earlier, Zach, I agree with you that at the end of the day, if you're going to have a full understanding of the Battle of Waterloo, it's imperative to have a thorough understanding of the whole campaign. And that includes not just Battle of Quatre Bras, but also Ligny and Wavre as well.
Indeed, indeed. We could rant, well, I certainly could rant for many hours on how, if you don't understand the implications of Quatre Bras and Ligny, you don't understand the Waterloo campaign, and you don't know how everything turns on a knife edge in the aftermath of it. But that, as I say, is a rant for another day. Let's consider kind of the nitty gritty of this battle, shall we? And start with those sort of key figures and their mindsets ahead of the Waterloo campaign. And I'm going to kind of start with the French perspective here. And Ney is the obvious starting point, isn't he? You know, what kind of health is Ney in? Because, you know, we think about psychology and the significance of the psychological dimension and the way that people have kind of grown to appreciate that significance in recent years. There has been a lot of talk about him potentially suffering PTSD by this point, sort of in the wake of the Russian campaign. Where is Ney in kind of the course of his career and his kind of peaks and troughs in success?
Okay, I mean, he's an interesting character. I've got to say, I think as far as the era we're talking about, this whole PTSD, combat fatigue aspect is somewhat overplayed. I'm not suggesting it didn't exist then, but at the end of the day, his level of experience and trauma that he'd experienced over his career was no different to many, if not most, of Napoleon's senior and junior commanders. So I think they're very different people in those days. So I wouldn't try to claim that he was suffering from PTSD. But having said that, his performance during the Waterloo campaign was not particularly inspirational. And I think this is probably down to two reasons, really. First of all, politically, perhaps that's the right word, and secondly, militarily. So politically, 1814, he pledges allegiance to Louis the 18th and thinks he's done with Napoleon. Napoleon returns. Ney promises Louis he's going to bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage, and then changes sides, changes his mind, and throws his lot in with Napoleon. But what must have been going through his mind, even while he was trying to decide whether that is what he should do or not, is that question of what's going to happen if Napoleon is defeated. Anyway, it was a leap of faith, really, and one he may not have been totally confident in. At the end of the day, the odds of Napoleon succeeding were overwhelming, probably, not just whether Napoleon's actually going to be able to take power, but whether the rest of Europe were going to allow him to stay on the throne if that's what he was going to do. So that's going to be playing on his mind. And as things go on, as the campaign goes on, is this going the way I want them? What's going to happen to me if this all goes horribly wrong? And also, when Napoleon does take power again, he does somewhat snub Ney and ignores him. And to be honest with you, I have no doubt in my mind that he only calls Ney to the army very late. I think it was the 11th. He wrote, the 11th of June he wrote to him, because Napoleon was desperately short of experienced senior commanders. Many had chosen to stay loyal to Louis, and many others had decided not to serve again. And Napoleon was really scratching around. So I think that was behind it. And that too might have been preying on his mind. As far as militarily is concerned, of course, he gets called forward on the 11th. He gets there on about the 14th. He's handed a huge command, the left wing, about 40,000 plus men, And yet he had no staff. He had 2 aides-de-camp, that's all, one of whom, a colonel, had to serve as his chief of staff. Normally, for a marshal, that would have been a major or lieutenant general. He doesn't know any of his senior commanders. He doesn't know what formations make up his command. He doesn't know the men in them. He doesn't know the units, commanders. He's really thrown in at the deep end. And so he was going to struggle to exercise the command that he was given as well. So, I think really his late appointment just highlights the shortage that Napoleon had in his most senior commanders.
Was he the right person for the job, or was it a case that he was just the only person for the job? Were there better qualified individuals who could perhaps have done a better job with the left wing of the army, or was it a case of, Ney's just, I need anyone, Ney's got the experience, it'll have to be him?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think that's one that's been discussed quite a lot. I think Soult had a great experience as a corps commander, and he would have managed as an army commander indeed, and would have handled a wing perfectly competently. And of course, Davout, who was left as the Minister of War back in Paris, again, he would have been outstanding, I don't doubt. So I'm not sure that he was the best choice, but Napoleon clearly decided Davout was vital to have holding the reins of power, if you like, back in Paris, and pulling that all together and keeping a grip of the rest of the army, as well as the army that Napoleon was commanding, and that he needed an experienced chief of staff. And with the loss of Berthier, who'd been his chief of staff for over 20 years before that, there weren't too many that offered him a strong alternative. And I think probably that Soult was probably the best option for him, and that left him short of field commanders. And everyone knows that Ney was very popular in the army and had a great reputation, in the field.
And what about other commanders on the French side at Quatre Bras? I'm thinking of people like Jerome Bonaparte, Kellerman, d'Erlon. Give those folks who perhaps aren't familiar with the history and these names just a kind of a sense of these men's careers and their reputations.
I mean, that's that little list of people that you've given me there is just highlights perfectly this problem that Napoleon had in appointing experienced, dependable formation commanders. His brother Jerome had little experience commanding a division and little experience commanding a corps, and he got sacked from doing both. He had very little command experience in the field. He joined the Navy originally, so he had very mixed a career as a formation commander. He was not highly regarded by his fellow generals, and Napoleon allocated him a very experienced chief of staff in order to keep an eye on him and to make sure that he was being pushed in the right direction. So, Jerome as a divisional commander, and in fact, commanding the strongest division, line division in the army, that just shows how short he was of really competent divisional commanders. Kellerman, the hero of Marengo, where he saved Napoleon from defeat. But he had, throughout his career, he'd been critical of Napoleon. He'd thrown in his lot with Louis in 1814, and he had tried to rally the army against Napoleon when Napoleon returned. And so, naturally, Napoleon wouldn't have wanted to appoint him to command, but Napoleon was desperately short of experienced heavy cavalry commanders, and Napoleon wouldn't have argued that Kellerman was very capable at doing that. And therefore, he commanded 3rd Heavy Cavalry Corps, but here was a man that perhaps Napoleon couldn't wholly trust. And then perhaps d'Erlon, very loyal, and therefore probably Napoleon didn't hesitate to allocate him a corps. Very experienced divisional commander, very experienced corps commander in the peninsula, but had spent half his career being beaten by the British down there, and had a reputation of being rather ponderous and unimaginative. And I think his performance in 1815 really just showed that sort of judgment of him was pretty correct, really. And of course, he as we'll discuss later, I think, his role on the 16th just really underlined his shortcomings.
Absolutely. There is we've got a whole segment on oncoming folks. Just hold your horses, sit and wait that one out, because we are not going to let that stone go unturned. Let's turn to the Anglo-Dutch side now. I want to sidestep Wellington. People are going to be shocked to hear me say that. Yes, Wellington being pushed to the side of this. He gets enough coverage. I think there are far more interesting conversations for us to have about some of the others. And I want to start with Picton, partly because he dies early at Waterloo. So this is the last battle that he sees through to the end. Where's he at physically and mentally at this point?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that Picton was, if you like, a Premier League fighting divisional commander during the Peninsula. He sort of went out relatively late. I think it was 1810 or 1811, but he went out there at the direct request of Wellington. Wellington rated him as a fighting general, and of course his division, the famous 3rd Division, became known as a fighting third. So he was a very resolute, very capable divisional commander throughout the latter stages of the Peninsular War, probably from about 1810, 11 up until the end of 1814. He retired back to his sort of estate at the end of that campaign, and no surprise that when Wellington started putting his commanders back, his army together for 1815, that he called, again, he requested Picton. Why wouldn't you? Here was a guy with a great reputation. But what is interesting is that it appears that Picton was reluctant to serve again and wanted to retire, and that I've read that he had a premonition of his death. And he was reluctant to come. I haven't seen the evidence for that, but I don't doubt that was probably true. But he may have been reluctant, but of course, once he got out there, like any great commander, he threw himself into the job. He threw himself into his divisional command. As you say, took quite a leading role, or his division took a leading role at Quatre Bras. So I think he may have been reluctant, but I think once he was there, he was probably pretty ready to go.
Absolutely. And, full credit. Yes, I know Picton, a controversial character, but credit to him where it is due. He takes a wound, I believe it's in the groin at Quatre Bras, and hides it from everybody so that he can then stay on, because he knows that it's not over. So as you say, once he's out there, he does his job to the hilt.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the Dutch side as well. So we'll skip over some of the others on the British contingent to focus on the Dutch. We obviously have the much maligned Prince of Orange. We've had a chat about that already, and how we can probably thank the Sharp series for that. You've got the Comte de Rebecque, you've got Propencher. Apologies if I've mispronounced the name there. Tell us about their careers up to this point.
Okay, Prince of Orange, we can deal with relatively quickly. He had been commissioned into the Prussian army when he was only 16 in 1809. He then moved to England, went to university at Oxford, joined the British Army in 1811, and went to Spain to serve as one of Wellington's ADCs in the rank of colonel. So he's quite young, but he's sent there as an ADC. Wellington keep an eye on him, and as we'll come to it, Constant Rebecque was there as his mentor. He was present at a number of actions. He was very quickly noted for his courage. He was quite well liked by the other officers there. Of course, he was very young. What I find really interesting, and again, I haven't read much about, is during his time there, Wellington recommended that he should be attached to a brigade, because working in Wellington's headquarters, he wasn't getting any command experience. He never commanded soldiers on operations or things. So he recommended that he should be attached to a brigade where he could see things at the tactical level, rather than the sort of grand tactical or strategic level, which is what he was seeing working with Wellington. But he didn't actually do that. And I don't know why he didn't do it. Wellington wrote to Horse Guards suggesting this, but it didn't happen. Now, it might be that it was considered too dangerous and they didn't want the Prince of Orange killed, not least because, of course, politically Britain had an eye on the future of the Netherlands as having a friendly monarch in the future in charge of the Netherlands was very attractive. So perhaps the Horse Guard said, no, too dangerous, or perhaps Prince of Orange said, no, I'd rather stick with you, actually, boss. And therefore, and see things from your perspective and perhaps a little bit more comfortably as well. So I don't know the reason behind that, but it was interesting. But of course, what that means is when he returns to the Netherlands in 1813, he's got campaign experience, but no command experience. He immediately gets promoted to general in the Netherlands army, and takes over command of all the Allied troops in the Netherlands in 1814. But without that command experience, very quickly makes himself unpopular with the British contingent of those forces. Both General Hill, Clinton, Colborne, all write quite damning things about him. Wellington names him as commander of the First Corps, and that was a big corps, 2 British divisions, 2 Netherlands infantry divisions, and the Netherlands cavalry division. So 4 divisional command, that's a big command for someone who doesn't have that sort of background. And at Waterloo, although people say he was 23, he wasn't, he was actually 22. He wasn't 23 until December 1815. So he was commanding a very large corps aged 22. And again, he had Constant Rebec to help him, but that was a big responsibility. And I think we all know examples where his tactical shortcomings are shown in spades, but equally the feedback also, he was very courageous, both at Quatre Bras and at Waterloo, where of course he was eventually wounded. Constant Rebec, again, bearing in mind that many Dutch and Belgian generals, once France had invaded their countries and they had become part eventually of metropolitan France, served in the French army. Constant Rebec was one of those who didn't. He started his military career in a Swiss regiment in the service of France, but once the French had invaded his own country, he refused to serve under the French. He went to the Prussians for a time, and then he was appointed as mentor to the Prince of Orange, who of course at that time was in Prussia and had been commissioned with the Prussian army. And so those two stuck together. Now, Constant Rebec didn't have an awful lot of military experience. He had very little command experience, but he was highly regarded by Wellington because, of course, as he served with the Prince of Wales out in the peninsula and in Spain, Wellington saw a lot of him. So he was quite highly regarded. And I suspect Wellington was a lot happier knowing that Constant Rebec was to become his chief of staff through the Waterloo campaign than if he had not. And of course, really, the decision for the 2nd Netherlands Division to hold at Quatre Bras, to deploy there, to hold there, and to resist there was really primarily the decision of Constant Rebec, not the Prince of Orange, who, of course, by that time had gone to Brussels to warn Wellington of the attack of the French. So Constant Rebec, high-quality guy, may not have had much command experience, but a good, solid chief of staff, just what the Prince of Orange required. Finally, Papenchet, notably another Dutch general who refused to serve in the French army once they invaded in 1795, joined the Austrians before he transferred to the British. A bit of a mixed experience with them. He did do some fighting in Germany. He went to Egypt with them. He went to Portugal and on the Walcheren expedition. So he did have some command experience and campaign experience. But he returned to England in 1809 and then didn't really serve again until he went back to Holland in 1813 when it had been liberated. So he did have a break in his service. But again, at least he was someone that had not served the French, and therefore people saw him as pretty dependable.
So before we talk about the 16th of June, we have to discuss the preceding day, right? You can't take this in its isolation, because we nearly don't get, just as without a Quatre Bras and Ligny, you don't get a Waterloo, without the events on the 15th, you very nearly don't get a Quatre Bras, never mind a Waterloo. So talk us through the actions of Saxe-Weimar's brigade, because I personally look on this as the moment which saves the campaign for the Allies. Okay,
well, it's what a lot of people don't realise is that Saxe-Weimar, again, 23 years old, so quite a junior. He was colonel. He was actually the commander of the Orange Nassau Regiment in the Dutch Army. So he commanded a 2-battalion regiment within the 2nd Brigade of the 2nd Netherlands Division, and it was that brigade that was deployed around Quatre Bras. The real commander was a chap called Godecker, Colonel von Godecker, who was a Nassauer, but just before the campaign opened, he got kicked by his horse and was incapacitated, and so the young Saxe-Weimar was nominated to command. So here was a chap who was thrown on the sort of the day of the invasion into command of the brigade, and at that age, that must have been quite a big, quite a nervous moment for him. His brigade was deployed around Quatre Bras, but of course, the concentration orders had the 2nd Netherlands Division to concentrate at Nivelles to the west, and therefore, you know, if his orders, or if the orders had been followed, he would have left Quatre Bras, and that would have left the main road from Charleroi, where the French crossed the border, into up to Brussels, completely open. The Prussians had withdrawn to the east. The Allies, or Wellington's army, were concentrating to the west, and there was that gap in between. So the decision to leave the brigade there, which was a combination of Constant Rebec, of Perponcher as divisional commander, and Saxe-Weimar, who commanded the troops on the ground there, that was, as you say, absolutely critical decision that was made on the 15th to defend Quatre Bras. And if that had not happened, then the campaign would have played out in a completely different way. So we can't say that the decision saved the campaign for the Allies, but it certainly would have followed a fundamentally different sequence of events if the decision had not been made at those lower level of command to defend Quatre Bras.
And there is a point to be made about the fact the French don't reach Quatre Bras, which I believe I'm right in saying was the objective for day one. Is that right? So, and if so, you know, why is that the case? I
think this is still not fully understood, in so much as we can't be absolutely sure. Some historians say that Ney, having taken over command of the left wing, met up with Napoleon on the evening of the 5th and was told to rush forward and to on the 14th, when he joined the army, to rush forward and to seize Quatre Bras. There are many people that don't believe that meeting actually took place. I think the evidence is probably that it didn't take place, but there are one or two pieces of evidence quite hard to undermine. But what is clear that because things were slow in the morning of the 16th is whatever Ney might have been told at that meeting, he was not to move until he had been given the executive word of command. So you know you're going to move now. So that I'm pretty sure didn't come until the morning. But on the 15th, there's no doubt that Ney was expecting to advance as far as Quatre Bras. The Lancers of the Imperial Guard led the advance, and they came into contact with a Nassau battalion, which was based forward of Quatre Bras at the small village of Fan, and the Imperial Guard Lancers had a skirmish with them. The battalion withdrew back to Quatre Bras. The Lancers went forward and identified that there was a force at Quatre Bras, and then withdrew as it got dark on the evening of the 15th. So Ney knew that there were troops based there. What he didn't really have is an accurate number idea of how many were actually there. But there had been some fighting on the 15th, on the evening of the 15th, and therefore, you know, the news was that was passed up to Wellington at Brussels that there had been fighting near Quatre Bras.
And that leads really nicely actually into the next question that I wanted to ask, which is about this lull that we get on the morning of the 16th. So lovely bridging work from you there. You're doing my job for me. I appreciate it. Because there's this traditional kind of version of events which emphasizes the fragility of the Allied position, which is true, Ney's apprehension of Wellington and sort of a missed opportunity. But the beauty of your book, of course, is that you've worked closely with the French perspective. So what's actually going on the French side as the Allies rush to concentrate and as Wellington rides off to meet Blucher?
Okay, well, Ney had been given command of the 1st and 2nd Corps. Ney commanded the 2nd Corps. That was a corps that was leading, and it stopped for the night relatively close to Quatre Bras, around the town of Gosselies, with some troops forward at Fran that I've already mentioned. But for Ney, the problem was not the 2nd Corps. That was pretty well concentrated, ready to advance on the morning of the 16th. His problem really was d'Erlon's 1st Corps, divisions of which had been dropped off during the advance on the 15th to protect the left flank of the offensive. And Ney needed to get those divisions marched forward to join the whole, so the whole of 1st Corps were concentrated and behind the 2nd Corps so that he could advance with his full force. But some of those troops were so far back that with the need to call them forward, the time it took for them to march forward, having to file over the bridges over the Sambre River, that really held Ney up from advancing with his full corps, his full wing. So that was the first point. The second point was, as I've already mentioned, although Ney may have been expecting to advance to Quatre Bras the following morning, it seems that he was ordered to wait until Napoleon told him to actually move, because Napoleon was trying to sort out what was happening with the Prussians over on the right flank, if you like, to the east. And so Napoleon probably didn't want Ney marching off on to the west before he knew what was happening with the Prussians. And that does make perfect sense. However people criticize Ney or Napoleon for being slow on the morning of the 16th, Napoleon on the morning of the 16th, when it broke, still wasn't sure that the Prussians were going to fight there. And if the Prussians weren't going to fight there, perhaps the allies that were found at Quatre Bras weren't going to fight there. So he needed the bigger picture before he could come up with his final plan, and therefore he could give orders to Ney. So Ney's orders to advance and take position around Quatre Bras weren't given until later in the morning of the 16th. In fact, we estimate they got to Ney probably about 10:30, by which time Napoleon was increasingly confident that the Prussians were going to hold and that he was going to attack them. And therefore he wanted Ney to advance to Quatre Bras so that he could march down the Namur road, and that would bring his force onto the rear right of the Prussians, and hopefully that sort of pincer movement, if you like, with Napoleon attacking them from the center, would destroy the Prussian army and put it out of the campaign. And clearly that was, from Napoleon's perspective, that was the #1 priority. So Ney was waiting for his corps, or his 2 corps, to concentrate, and he was waiting for the executive word of command before he advanced against Quatre Bras. And what people don't seem to consider is that when Wellington arrived at Quatre Bras about 10 o'clock, there was no sign of the French. There was a little bit of skirmishing on the picket line, but when Wellington went forward with the Prince of Orange to look from the high ground down towards Fran and towards Gosselies, they could hardly see any French troops. Wellington left the Prince of Orange confident that he was not going to be attacked. He didn't change the Prince of Orange's deployment of the 2nd Division. So everyone says that that was really Wellington endorsing the Prince of Orange's deployment. But actually, Wellington wasn't particularly concerned because he didn't think the French were going to attack. He believed that Napoleon was concentrating his whole army against the Prussians. So he went off to meet Blucher to discuss how he could support the Prussians in the coming battle. And that's quite a significant point too. And of course, it was only as Wellington left and hearing the firing and getting back to Quatre Bras that he realized that actually there was an attack going on at Quatre Bras, and he needed to get his act together in order to stop the French seizing the crossroads from which he was supposed to be helping the Prussians.
Again, you've just done a lovely little bridge for me there straight away. I'm liking this. You can always run the interview yourself, because the French, as you say, do go on the offensive. And it doesn't take them long to make some pretty significant progress. If folks have walked the field, they'll know there's not a huge distance between Fran and Quatre Bras. You know, if you're not in the midst of a fight, you could do it in easily an hour, I would have said. Yeah. Something like that, yeah, depending on your speed. But of course, the French don't just have an easy ride of it. They are opposed as they go. Why are they able to gain the ground so swiftly?
Okay, I think the first thing is, of course, the Netherlands, the Second Netherlands Division, which were the only troops there at that time, about 8,000 men, were significantly outnumbered. Even though Ney advanced against them with only the Second Corps, we're talking there about 12,000 men, but the French hadn't all come up at that time. So the Prince of Orange was trying to defend a fairly extensive front with only few troops. So he had to decide about what sort of battle he was going to fight. Was he going to fight a delaying battle, giving troops, giving reinforcements time to get forward, or was he going to defend Quatre Bras from a sort of single defensive position? And that is exact latter that he chose. That's how he deployed his men. But what he seemed to do is he felt that the Bossu Wood to the west of the main road, because it dominated the road, that was a piece of vital ground that the French would have to take in order to take Quatre Bras if they were going to march up the Brussels road. He therefore put quite a bit of his force in the Bossu Wood and actually a lighter force across the open ground that stretched across to the east. And then he had a reserve back at the crossroads himself. From the French perspective, of course, Ney wanted to capture Quatre Bras as quickly as possible. How do you do that? You do that, first of all, by advancing in column, which is a much quicker way of advancing, and you do it across the open ground. So if you like, Ney had pretty much called the Prince of Orange's bluff right from the beginning by punching straight for the Quatre Bras crossroads and not getting bogged down in the close country and the close fighting that he would have to have done if he was going to attack into the Bossu Wood. And therefore, the few troops that the Prince of Orange had deployed in the open ground, he had to quickly try and reinforce from his own reserve back at Quatre Bras. And those troops were faced by a significant force of French infantry and cavalry. Remember, he had no cavalry at that time on the battlefield. The French vastly outnumbered him with artillery, and therefore he was on a bit of a hiding to nothing, really. He had very little chance of holding up what was a very strong French attack, and therefore he was quite quickly pushed back and very close to breaking when the first Allied reinforcements arrived on the battlefield.
We tend to talk quite a lot about the sort of questionable loyalty of the Dutch-Belgian troops. Certainly, that's said to be a contemporary fear. These, in a number of cases, will have been men who fought in the French army. Are they going to stand and fight against their former comrades? And that's the concern that kind of circles around certain quarters. How justified are those fears? Or are we, with the benefit of hindsight, kind of guilty of overplaying them?
I think certainly Wellington and the British Higher Command were more concerned about the Dutch and Belgian generals than they were perhaps the troops, because, as you say, many of them had fought for the French. Interestingly, although Perponchet, who commanded the division then, had not and had fought against the French, in the Netherlands Cavalry Division, the divisional commander, and all three brigade commanders had fought in the French army. And in fact, one or two of them had only left the French army on Napoleon returning to power in March. So only 3 months before, they'd been serving in the French army. So I think Wellington was more worried about the commanders. I think as far as the soldiers are concerned, we need to just stress, of course, that we shouldn't really be referring to them as Dutch Belgians, because you had the United Provinces, which we would call Holland, and you had Belgium, two separate entities and two separate countries. But of course, the Congress of Vienna had joined them into a united kingdom of the Netherlands, and therefore they were Netherlands troops. But having said that, of course, there was a difference between the viewpoint of the Dutch and the viewpoint of the Belgians. So from the Netherlands point of view, from the Dutch point of view, they had resented occupation from the French. They were reluctant soldiers in the French armies that they were forced to fight in, and they were desperate for independence, and they had fought for their independence as the French were pushed back. And therefore, I don't think there was any reason really for the Allies to worry about the loyalty of the Dutch. Different story, of course, to the Belgians, because at the end of the day, the Belgians had just lost their independence to the Netherlands. And the Dutch actually and the Belgians had a long history of fighting each other and being in competition with each other. So for the Dutch, they were happy because the Netherlands had got bigger. They had the Belgian part of their new country. But of course, from the Belgian point of view, they'd lost their independence. And you've got to ask what the soldiers were thinking, fighting for a crown and a country that they had no loyalty towards. And so I certainly have some sympathy with the Belgians. The Belgians, many more of the Belgian soldiers had fought in the French army than the Dutch had. And actually, the French rated the Belgians as fighters and weren't quite so enthusiastic about the Dutch. So, not only were perhaps the Allies worried about the loyalty, but the French also saw this as an opportunity and were hoping that the Belgians would change sides, as the Saxons had done at Leipzig. And Napoleon opened a depot for Belgian deserters so he could raise a regiment of Belgian troops to fight in his army. And some Belgians, it's true, despite what many people have claimed, many Belgians did desert, but also other nationalities as well. And the number of troops that were at this depot never exceeded 400. So it was going to be less than a pretty weak battalion. So I think we can all look back and say, the Dutch, Belgians, the Netherlanders covered themselves in glory. They were loyal and they fought hard against the French. And I think that's absolutely true. But equally, I think you can worry about what the Belgians were thinking. And I think it was quite justified that some people had some concerns about their loyalty.
So you've alluded to this just a touch already, but let's go back to the battle, and we kind of left it at that point of Ney's advancing on the crossroads. He's pushing the Prince of Orange's troops back, and the French are one significant push away from the crossroads, and then they've got that anchor point from which they can then dominate the next move of the campaign. So what saves the Anglo-Dutch army from the jaws of that defeat that's impending?
Okay, this is a pretty simple answer. There are two things. First of all, reinforcements arriving right at the critical moment. I mean, Wellington had it said that when he arrived there, that there were some troops rushing out of the back of the Bossu Wood, and the Prince of Orange sort of said they were his troops, and he said no, they're not, they're French. So Wellington's perspective, it may have been a bit of a tall story, was that the French were, just within a few hundred yards of the crossroads. So certainly reinforcements arriving, and secondly, Wellington arriving. And so I think we had an older, wiser head taking command of the situation, and we had the timely arrival, funny enough, of Picton's division that had arrived, and with those, Wellington was able to reinforce the line, and it was probably that really saved Wellington's skin.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom, like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the story of Quatre Bras, isn't it? Sort of, well, from the Allied side, we should emphasize that, troops arriving in the nick of time and being pushed straight into almost a kind of firefighting scenario of I need you there right now kind of thing. But we can't not talk about the Duke of Brunswick, because this is obviously a significant and quite sad episode in the course of the battle. Obviously, every death is sad, but Brunswick is and his cavalry are sent in. Why are they sent in, and what kind of impact does his death have?
Okay, well, the Brunswick, or part of the Brunswick Corps, was some of the first Allied troops to arrive on the battlefield, along with Picton's division. And although I am sure that Wellington would have preferred not to have thrown them straight into battle, he really had no option. Picton's division was deployed to the east of the Brussels road, the main road, and Wellington needed troops to reinforce the west of the Brussels road, and those were the troops that he had available to him. And so, although I have no doubt he would like to have held them back for a time, got them used to the sounds and sights of battle before they got committed and thrown into battle, he had no option but to send some of the battalions through, reinforced or supported, as you say, by some of the Brunswick cavalry. The artillery hadn't arrived, so those poor troops had no artillery support. And as we've already said, the French were very heavy on artillery and were really pounding the Allied troops. And so the Brunswickers were deployed forward in line with Picton's troops, without artillery support, and with only cavalry to support them. But of course, they were no protection against artillery. So the situation was so critical that Wellington had no option really but to deploy some of them straight into the line. And bear in mind, like I say, their lack of experience, and many of the eyewitnesses say how young the Brunswick troops were. They often refer to them as boys and lads. So these weren't the troops that you would have wanted to throw into the front line in a crisis. The Duke had quite a lot of military experience, and of course I think everyone knows and realizes that he was quite an inspirational leader as his troops were getting pounded by the French artillery. He sat on his horse in front of them, smoking his pipe and setting an example for the young troops. And of course, on that basis, and as a French infantry, the swarms of French infantry skirmishers advanced, he was clearly going to be a prime target, and so it was no surprise that he was going to be struck. He handed over command to Colonel Olferman, again quite an experienced and capable commander, but the impact on the troops is hard to assess, because the French broke the forward Brunswick infantry. The Brunswick cavalry were sent forward to try and throw the French back and give them some respite. Those in their turn were driven back by the French cavalry, and the forward battalions ran back to Quatre Bras. How much that was the result of the death of the Duke, and how much of that was the military situation of the time, and a reflection perhaps of the casualties and the horror of being pounded by artillery, is a little bit hard to assess. But in retrospect, it is felt that the loss of the Duke did have an impact on the troops, as you'd expect it to.
And we promised everyone a Durlon segment, so this seems like as good a moment as any to give them their wish, because folks will want this. We have to pause, don't we, to consider Durlon, possibly the greatest what if of this whole campaign. Possibly there are a couple of other contenders there, although admittedly that'll be because I've always thought the idea of blaming Grouchy for not much to the sound of the guns was ludicrous, when you consider that you couldn't have got to Waterloo any faster than the Prussians did, and therefore wouldn't have made any difference. That rant on Grouchy aside, unless you particularly want to indulge that rant, you are the man to talk to on Grouchy. Durlon, he spends the 16th of June essentially marching from Quatre Bras to Ligny and then back again. As far as I'm concerned, had he been committed to either battle, there is no question in my mind that would have transformed the campaign. So who's to blame? And I know we've had discussions about this in the past. Who's to blame for the failure to exploit the potential that his corps represented?
Okay, I think the simple answer has got to be Marshal Ney, and then a poor second to him, Durlon himself, and I'll explain that. But before we do that, we've got to set the scene. We've got Ney with the Second Corps fighting at Quatre Bras. we've got Allied reinforcements arriving on the battlefield, and if you like, the battle turning against Ney. You've got D'Erlon marching his corps forward to join up with Marshal Ney. And as they march forward, a messenger arrives from Napoleon, who orders the corps to turn to the east and to march onto the western flank of the Prussian army in order to ensure the destruction of the Prussian army. So the whole of the corps turned off the main road and marched towards Ligny. D'Erlon claims that he was forward towards Quatre Bras when he got a messenger from his own corps telling him that his corps had turned to the east and were marching on Ligny on the order of Napoleon himself. D'Erlon rushes off to join his corps, sees that that's what's happening, and sends his chief of staff, Colonel Laurent, to Ney to warn Ney that he is now marching to the aid of Napoleon. So poor old Laurent joins Ney just as the battle is turning against him. And it is little surprise that Ney is a bit frustrated and a bit angry by this. And so really, without thinking, it's clear he cannot have thought about this. He sends Laurent back and demands that D'Erlon should march back to Quatre Bras to save the battle for Ney there. Now, if Ney had done his maths right, or looked at a map, or put some thought to it, he would have realized that by the time D'Erlon had turned his troops around and marched back to Quatre Bras, he would be too late to get involved in that battle. Now, it's perfectly legitimate to argue, well, Ney didn't know how far D'Erlon's corps was, but what he was doing was clearly going against a direct order from Napoleon, and he was failing to understand why Napoleon wanted D'Erlon at Ligny, because he wanted to destroy the Prussian army so then he could concentrate and destroy Wellington in his turn. So he wanted to destroy the Prussian army. The way of doing that was for these troops to get involved in the battle for Ligny. Just as D'Erlon arrives on the battlefield, the message comes back from Ney, D'Erlon's immediate commander: you must now march to Quatre Bras. So D'Erlon is now faced with a dilemma. What he decides to do is to leave one division, his 4th Division, Duras Division, to continue the march towards Ligny, and one brigade of his cavalry division. And then he turns around the other 3 divisions and marches back to Quatre Bras. And as we say, he gets there too late to have any impact on Quatre Bras. And Duras, who's told by D'Erlon to be very careful and cautious in his advance against the Prussian flank, really does get involved in the fighting, but by that time it's really late in the battle, and he's so cautious that it has no effect on the fighting at Ligny. And obviously, to Napoleon's great frustration, that means that D'Erlon makes no impact at Ligny, and we know makes no impact at Quatre Bras as well. I think, as you rightly say, I think if all of D'Erlon's troops had arrived at Quatre Bras, there is an arguable case to say that Wellington would have been pushed off the crossroads.
Absolutely. We could discuss this all day. There's a whole interesting thing about the arrival of D'Erlon at Ligny, and Napoleon's sort of not having received the intelligence that he needed, or perhaps just not having enough of a grasp of where everybody was to know that, that's D'Erlon, that's not Wellington, this is the plan coming together. But that is a conversation for, I guess, another day, unless you want to say something about that now.
Well, all I was going to say is that Napoleon was expecting Ney to pretty much seize Quatre Bras without much of a fight. So he was expecting Ney to then send the troops that Napoleon had ordered him to down the main road, which would have brought them into the rear right flank of the Prussian army. Of course, by calling D'Erlon across from where D'Erlon actually was, he brought them in sort of due east, and therefore it was as much on the left flank of Napoleon's army as it was the right flank of the Prussians. And so both of them were surprised by the appearance of these troops, as you say, where they came in. And Napoleon had to waste quite a lot of time to determine that they were French troops rather than either Wellington's troops or another force of Prussians.
So taking it back to Quatre Bras, by 5 p.m., it always strikes me that, you know, this battle, it still seems to be in the balance. Why is Kellerman sent forward with his cuirassiers? Is that desperation? Is it the right move at the right time? Because they themselves make some pretty remarkable progress.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the answer to your question is desperation. No doubt about that. Kellerman's brigade, the only brigade out of his 4 that was available to him on the battlefield, the other 3 brigades were too far away to have any impact on the battle, were less than 800 men. So it's quite a weak brigade, 750 or so, depending on who you read. And they were charging by, well, at that time, Wellington had 20,000 men in the field. Now, they weren't all in the front line, and they weren't all combat capable, but it was absolute desperation to launch so few troops against a largely infantry force. About that time, Wellington was beginning to feel that the advantage was swinging in his favour, and yet Ney, he was reflecting that he was facing a deteriorating situation, and it was at that moment that Ney received an order from Napoleon that had been written by Soult, saying it was time that he must send troops to help Napoleon out, this note included those famous lines, "The fate of France is in your hands." So just as he's losing control of the battle, Napoleon is saying, the fate of France is in your hands, you've got to do something. And so, Ney had to decide what to do. So he had to make a last desperate gamble to try and seize the crossroads so that he could send some troops perhaps down the main road to support Napoleon. And again, as if timing couldn't have been worse for Ney, just as he was contemplating this message from Napoleon saying, maneuver towards me, and he was losing the battle, he then gets information that D'Erlon's corps has been sent over to Ligny. So he doesn't have any troops available to launch this attack because the Second Corps had been fighting for the battle, throughout the battle, and were getting pretty much exhausted and no doubt probably short of ammunition too. The light cavalry division that he had from the Second Corps, again, had been committed a number of times. This brigade of cuirassiers were the only fresh troops that he had available. So in his anger and his frustration, he got hold of Kellerman and ordered him to charge the Allied line. There could have been no hope for the success of that charge, and the success that they did achieve is all the remarkable for that. That they, of course, broke the 2nd 69th, the South Lincolns, and took one of their colours. Both the 33rd and the, I think it was the 73rd, on being charged, broke and ran and took refuge in the Bossu Wood, leaving only the 30th holding firm in square. The cuirassiers bypassed them and carried on right up to Quatre Bras itself. In fact, there's some stories which say they had cuirassiers riding into the courtyard of the Quatre Bras farm. I find that a little bit hard to believe, but it seems that there's no doubt that those few men actually got right up to the Quatre Bras crossroads before they came under so much fire and had lost so much organisation that they had no option but to withdraw again.
How does Ney respond to that? Because that's quite a startling thing. Because as you say, he's getting all of these messages. He's making this last-ditch attempt. He must know that the odds are not stacked in his favour when he sends Kellerman in, and yet the reports, the intelligence must have come back at some point. We're doing really well. The crossroads is in touch, and yet, as you say, D'Erlon's been sent off. He's got nothing to capitalize on that? Is there any sense of how he responded to this of, if only I had a division right here, right now, I could achieve X?
Well, all the divisions of Ray's corps were committed, as I say. The extent of the charge was out of range of the French artillery, and it does seem that none was pushed forward on the trace of the charge in order to try and give it some support. But I can imagine that the ground, it would have been quite difficult for that, and I suspect the charge was fairly brief. It reached its high watermark at Quatre Bras, and it turned back and came back almost as quickly, if not quicker, than it went forward. And of course, as some British troops or some Allied troops had been bypassed by the cuirassiers, so if you'd have pushed artillery forward while it was limbered up, there was a good chance that those crews would have been shot down, or horses would have been shot down by the Allied infantry. And of course, as you say, there were no fresh infantry available to Ney, and therefore he couldn't have supported it with infantry because he really didn't have much available. So it was a desperate gamble, there's no doubt, and I don't think it was. I don't believe even Ney could have been surprised that it failed.
Let's focus now on the fighting towards the end of the day, because the battle does continue well into the evening. Essentially, sort of darkness is part of what brings us to a halt, besides exhaustion. Talk us through what happens. I always feel that there's a tendency to just sort of gloss over this bit and go, okay, it ends in a sort of a stalemate, and neither side has really gained much over the course of the day, and we don't focus on what feels like a fair bit of fighting over the landscape that the battle has ebbed and flowed on over the course of the day.
Okay, I think first of all we've got to understand again what the numbers are here, because actually Ney had received no further reinforcements than he had at about 3 o'clock, when the whole of Ray's Second Corps was present, and those were about 16,000 troops, let's say, or 16.5 with the cavalry that it had available, and about 50 odd guns. The Anglo-Netherlands army by that time counted over 22,000. They had cavalry there, they had 40 odd guns, they were almost outnumbering the French in artillery as well. So that numerically the odds had turned around. And of course, many of the Allied troops were quite fresh. Yes, they were tired from marching, but they were fresh to the fight. By this time, all the troops that Ney had were the troops that had been fighting there all day, as I say, probably exhausted, very hot day, and probably short of ammunition. He had nothing left to fight back. But equally, he had advanced. I think probably it's fair to say, given even the Allied accounts, that the troops had probably almost taken the whole of the Bossu Wood, if you like, this is a French high water mark, and that the French infantry were only a few hundred meters short of Quatre Bras itself. And so, the French had achieved an awful lot. What they hadn't done is have sufficient strength to actually seize Quatre Bras. And then, of course, they faced the situation where they were now being overwhelmed by the Allied reinforcements. So having got so far forward, the last hour or two of the day was now Wellington taking advantage of his superior numbers and beginning to push the French back. And therefore, there was perhaps a little bit uncoordinated, but a general advance against the French, who, exhausted, their cavalry charge just defeated, were now beginning to struggle, and slowly and surely the Allies were able to push the French right back to their start line that they'd started on in the morning. And once the French had got there, it appears that they did then go firm, and the Allied troops that were pursuing them got held up at that point, and that was a point that the battle drew to an end. So there was quite a large Allied advance at the end of the day, of probably 1 kilometre or so, which pushed the French back to the start line of the morning. But I don't know that there was very heavy fighting there. It was more of a French fighting withdrawal than it was an Allied general attack.
Interesting. Thank you for that. I've always been curious about that. It's always nice when you do one of these episodes and you learn something rather than just ask questions that you think you know an answer to already. Can I ask about your general thoughts about the landscape of Quatre Bras itself. Obviously, a lot's changed now. The Bois de Bossu, the wood, has gone. There's literally nothing left of it. Yes, you've got a few memorials that have been put up. The farm is now gone. Very kind of sad thing in itself. Such a key piece of history has been flattened. Obviously, there's a nice little petrol station there now that wasn't there originally, I'm guessing. But it's an undulating landscape, isn't it? It's worth saying to folks, this is farmland, and there are signs up saying this is private land. Please don't go wandering over my crops. So you have a little bit less freedom to roam than you perhaps do at Waterloo, although again, you have to be mindful that this is a working landscape and you shouldn't stand on the farmer's turnips or his wheat or whatever. But it's a landscape that ripples, if you know what I mean. How much of a role do you think that had to play? And I'm thinking in terms of particularly Ney having to read this situation and Wellington having that reputation for hiding men behind ridges. And there are lots of dips in the landscape where he could have hid men. Do you think that has a role to play in terms of how Ney approaches the battle?
First of all, I'd say it's really difficult to understand a battle without having stood on the ground and looked at it. And it is a tragedy that the farm was knocked down. It was a tragedy that the wood was cut down, bearing in mind it was Wellington that had it cut down. But there is still plenty to see. And even though, as you say, you can't wander across the fields there, there are sufficient tracks, sufficient roadways for you to have a really good feel for the ground, and without which you can't really understand the battle. You're absolutely right. It wasn't a typical sort of Wellingtonian position with a ridge line behind which he could hide his troops. But then Wellington had never expected to fight there. But as you say, it is marked by this succession of low ridge lines, most of which cut by small streams in between. And I think the biggest impact that had on the battle was more the fact that it was very good country for the French artillery, because they were able to advance bound by bound onto these small ridge lines, which gave them a great field of fire. And although, of course, the Allied troops at times in the battle were able to hide in those hollows, actually the sort of, once the French had taken Gemiancourt, the large farm right in the middle, and advanced onto the high ground beyond that, actually there was nowhere for the Allied to hide except in the wood. And the French artillery really did have a big impact on this battle. When Picton's division advanced and really pushed the first French attack back, the reason the British turned and withdrew again was the pounding that they were taking primarily from the French artillery. The infantry did rally and fight back, but the artillery is what is mentioned so much by the British accounts, and the clouds of French skirmishers who actually used the farmland, these little ridges and the crops to hide and bring the Allies under fire. So it's a fascinating little battlefield to visit. I wouldn't put people off, but what you could do is be fairly careful about where you find to park up and walk and look at the battlefield, because obviously the main road to Brussels is very busy as well. But it's certainly worth a visit. You just have to be fairly careful about where you go, and a good map of the area is I would strongly recommend.
Absolutely. Having been there myself and spent only a morning there, which was a shame, but I enjoyed it enormously. There are places that you can park, provided you're careful, folks. But yes, well worth a visit. It's, as you say, it's just a shame that the farm has gone. And be careful about the stinging nettles as well, is the only other thing that I'd say. Having suffered myself, plenty of dock leaves around, fortunately, to deal with that. But yeah, watch out for the nettles, folks, because even in sturdy shoes, they manage to find their way through. So ultimately, to cut off my ramble about foliage on the Quatre Bras battlefield, who wins this? I often talk about it as a bloody stalemate. Is that fair?
It's an interesting question, because I think this is something everyone could discuss for some time. And I think it depends on the perspective that you want to take. I think from Wellington's perspective, he had won a tactical victory. He defended Quatre Bras, and he'd eventually thrown back the French back to their start lines. So tactically, I think you can call it an Allied victory. It's easier to argue that Wellington actually suffered a strategic defeat. At the end of the day, when he met with Blucher, he promised Blucher that he would maneuver in such a way to support Blucher. As you probably know, or many people might know, actually what was promised at that meeting varies depending on whose account you read, whether it was Wellington's or whether it was a Prussian account. But whatever happened, what was actually said, Wellington left there believing that he was going to maneuver in such a way as to support the Prussians against the French. And he was unable to do that because of the battle that he ended up in with Ney. So you could argue, if you were French, that Wellington had suffered a strategic defeat because Ney had prevented Wellington's army from interfering with Napoleon's victory over the Prussians. From Ney's perspective, of course, he suffered a tactical defeat by failing capture Quatre Bras, and he also suffered a strategic defeat because, as far as Wellington was concerned, part of Ney's job was to send many of his troops to Napoleon's support in destroying and defeating the Prussians. However, you could also argue from the strategic perspective that Ney had a strategic victory because he prevented Wellington from marching to the aid of the Prussians. So there's two very different perspectives, and I know that all of those are arguable, and I think that's why people prefer to call it a stalemate, because it's all a little bit of a mess. But each of those really is true. Tactical victory for Wellington, strategic defeat, tactical defeat for Ney, a strategic success, and a strategic defeat.
Yes, as you say, messy, but hey, this is why we love doing this job, right? Because history is messy. And if it was all very simple and black and white, folks like you and me wouldn't have a job. Andrew, an absolute joy. Before we go, do you want to comment on my little rant about Grouchy, or do you want to save that for another time?
Whoa, blimey. I've listened to a number of people speaking about Grouchy. And of course, I've read a book. I've written a book about it, so I've looked at all the French accounts and all the French orders that I can find. I have no doubt that there was never any chance of Grouchy appearing at Waterloo, and I don't think he could have done that without having the benefit of hindsight. The whole thing about marching to the sound of the guns is an accepted, if you like, tactic. But that's only a tactic if you are part of the army that is fighting the battle. Grouchy was not part of Napoleon's army fighting at Waterloo. It had a separate mission and its own force structure. And therefore, if he'd have marched to the sound of the guns, he would have gone against the orders that he received from Napoleon, and he would have gone against general tactical and grand tactical practice of the time. I think that's probably all we've got time for.
Absolutely, but there is a whole interview to be had there, which we can perhaps look forward to scheduling in the future, because you've written a cracking book there, and I would love to send those people who like to blame everything on Grouchy away with a flea in their ear about how it's just a little bit more complex than perhaps some folks would like to lead us believe. Andrew, as I say, an absolute joy. So your books, I'm going to go through them all, folks. Get a pen and paper ready and jot these down, because in the run up to Christmas, you're going to want to add these to your list. So Grouchy's Waterloo, add that to your list. Obviously, we'll try and schedule in an interview on that in due course. Waterloo, Rout and Retreat. The French at Waterloo Eyewitness Accounts, there's 2 volumes of that. And Talavera, Wellington's First Victory in Spain. And of course, Quatre Bras, Prelude to Waterloo. Andrew, you're not on social media, are you?
No, I'm afraid I'm too old for that.
Never say never, my friend.
I keep telling myself that I should be, but I'm afraid not. I mean, if anybody has listened to this and has got any question or points they really want to put make, then I would be delighted to hear from them. But they'll have to manoeuvre that through you, Zach, or through the website.
Absolutely. Get in touch, folks, and I can always forward things to Andrew. Very happy to do that. Andrew, thank you ever so much for your time. Have a very Merry Christmas if I don't see you beforehand, and thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, real pleasure. Thanks very much, Zach, and a happy Christmas to everyone out there. Thanks a lot.
Quick favour to ask, folks. Remember to like, share, retweet, and leave a review. It'll take a few seconds, but it makes a big impact on the algorithms, which means that the show reaches more people. Thank you to those of you who are already doing it. It's making a phenomenal difference. Listeners are up 300% on last year, 1,000 people are tuning into every episode, and hundreds are listening to this show more than any other. That is down to you. Of course, none of that would have been possible without my Patreon supporters. There was a point in the last 12 months where I seriously considered ending the show. That the podcast is still out and going from strength to strength is down to your support. If you are interested in joining their ranks, check the link in the description. There are all kinds of perks. It's not a something for nothing deal, and you can even now request content. You can demand certain episodes within particular tiers. If a regular subscription isn't for you, you can leave one-off tips via Ko-fi. Again, the link is in the description, and as ever, thank you so much for your support. Shoutouts and much love, as always, go to my Emperor level patrons, Mark Stoos and JC Kaiser, my Commander patrons, Ger Brown, Jane Davis, Marcus Cribb, Matt Bone, Bob Burnham and Stephen Gillen, and my mentioned in Dispatches patrons, Alexandra Leon, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Beatrice de Graaf, Brendan Teeling, Colin Fieldhouse, Ed Koss, an anonymous Canadian, Gareth Copeland, Jeff Maple, Hugh Brennan, James Bevan, Jim Deary, Jim Getz, John Haynes, Josh Keeney, Lucy Tatner, Lynn Dawson, Mark Dewhurst, Rob Griffith, Roy Muir, Ross Flowers, Ryan Diamond and Stephen Coulson. I'll be back in a fortnight with a Christmas special. Yes, you heard me right, a Christmas special. Who said there are delusions of grandeur on this show? I will be joined by a host of great guests as we debate the most misunderstood person of the Napoleonic era in what I hope will be something that matches the whole idea of Christmas being the season of goodwill and redemption for all mankind. Until then, I'm Zach White. This has been The Napoleonicist. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm Daniel, founder of Pretty Litter. Cats and cat owners deserve better than any old-fashioned litter. That's why I teamed up with scientists and veterinarians to create Pretty Litter. Its innovative crystal formula has superior odor control and weighs up to 80% less than clay litter. Pretty Litter even monitors health by changing colors to help detect early signs of potential illness. It's the world's smartest kitty litter.
Go to prettylitter.com and use code ACAST for 20% off your first order and a free cat toy. Terms and conditions apply. See site for details.